So welcome everyone to the third webinar of the Manitoba Important Bird Areas Program Spring Webinar Series. My name is Amanda and I am the coordinator of the Manitoba IBA program. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are joining this webinar from across the province of Manitoba in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, and Oji-Cree nations and the homeland of the Métis Nation. The Nature Manitoba office sits in Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe peoples and homeland of the Métis Nation. All these people have been caretakers of the land since time immemorial and continue to be strong caretakers today and into the future. We are here today to talk about the red-headed woodpecker. Today I will be the presenter, so please bear with me in managing the chat at the end for questions. As I mentioned, I'm the coordinator of the Manitoba IBA program, and I also coordinate the Manitoba Chimney Swift Initiative at Nature Manitoba. So you may know me from one program or the other. I have a Master of Science degree in ornithology that I completed at the University of Manitoba, where I studied the impact of climate change on spring migration and the nesting of purple martins across Canada and the United States. I got my start with the Manitoba IBA program by volunteering at bird blitzes at our various important bird areas before coming to work at Nature Manitoba in 2019. So I'll get started with the webinar without further ado. And thank you everybody for joining us today. So as you might have guessed from the title, today we're going to be learning all about the red-headed woodpecker. We'll be going through all different aspects of the life history and a little bit of history itself about the red-headed woodpecker and what we know about it, including how to identify it and how to tell it apart from our other woodpeckers that we have in Manitoba. As well as a bit of a history about the red-headed woodpecker and its name or various names, some adaptations that make the red-headed woodpecker and woodpecker in general stand apart from other birds, where you can find the red-headed woodpecker in Manitoba, its designation as a species at risk, as well as some of the work we've been doing with red-headed woodpeckers in the Important Bird Areas program in Manitoba. So how to identify? The red-headed woodpecker is a mid-sized woodpecker. So it is neither our largest or smallest woodpecker in Manitoba. Male and female red-headed woodpeckers look the same. Probably the easiest identification for the woodpecker is its distinct entirely red head and neck. And they also have quite a heavy looking beak. They also have an entirely white belly, and they have a black back with white wing patches. So if you can't see the back of the red-headed woodpecker in this photo, but if you were to look at its back, you would see the red of the head, the black of the upper back and upper wings, then you'd see a white stripe, and then the black tail, which you'll see in some of the other photos as we go through. So if you're looking to identify the red-headed woodpecker by sound, their most common call is a shrill hoarse chirr, or you may have heard it being called the quirr call. And if you're looking to identify it through drumming, they use 1 second bursts of 19 to 25 beats per second, repeated 2 to 3 times. So it's a very fast staccato drumming noise. And I'm going to play it here. Hopefully you guys can hear it through the webinar screen. But if not, I can send a link to the sound as well if you're interested in hearing it. So let's try this. Oh. So hopefully you could hear that. You could hear another bird in the background, but I think the quirr call and the drumming was quite obvious in the forefront there. So in terms of the other woodpeckers that we can find in Manitoba, if you look at the image here, you can see that there are a lot of similarities in color. So our red-headed woodpecker, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen with its entirely red head. Just above it on the right, we have the hairy woodpecker, which also has that black and white color scheme. In this image, it's a female, but if you were to see the the male hairy woodpecker, they would have red on the back of the head. We also have in the middle the pileated woodpecker, and this is our largest woodpecker species in Manitoba. And they also have red on the head. Both the males and the females have the red crest. It kind of looks like a red mohawk. And the male pileated woodpeckers do have some red on their face. You can see in the picture here. That area of red on the cheek is called the malar stripe. And in female pileated woodpeckers, that would be black. If we go to the sort of upper left area of the screen in the back, we have a yellow-bellied sapsucker. The male has red both on the forehead and on the throat, while the female would just have red on the forehead. Below the yellow-bellied sapsucker, we have possibly the closest looking woodpecker to the red-headed woodpecker, which would be the red-bellied woodpecker. This is a male, and you can see the red starts at the forehead, goes around the back of the head to the neck. And then our smallest woodpecker species we have in Manitoba is the downy woodpecker. And the male also has a small patch of red on the back of the head. So you can see the black, white, and red color scheme is quite common throughout woodpeckers, but the only woodpecker with the entirely red head is the red-headed woodpecker. We do have a couple more woodpecker species in Manitoba that aren't shown here, but they do look quite different. They don't have red on them in a similar color scheme to the species we've shown here. In terms of the overall range for the red-headed woodpecker, they are a migratory species. So you can see the breeding range shown in this sort of orangey peachy color here. In Manitoba, red-headed woodpeckers breed in the southern, northwest, and interlake regions. They do reach further north, and particularly further towards the northwest than shown in the range map here. They arrive in Manitoba around mid-May and depart in Manitoba in late September. We do have the occasional red-headed woodpecker that will stay here through the winter, but that is not common, and that's not what the majority of red-headed woodpeckers do. You can see the area in the range map here in purple, which is labeled both breeding and wintering. So in the central and eastern United States, red-headed woodpeckers can stay in the same area year-round, although they won't stay on a breeding territory. But interestingly, for red-headed woodpecker migration, a lot of where the woodpeckers go is really depending on hard mast. And hard mast would be referring to nuts, such as things like acorns and beech nuts and chestnuts. So when they migrate, they really follow where the food is sort of their important indicator, rather than having a specific area they would go to in the winter. So a little bit of the history of red-headed woodpecker and its interactions with people. So of course, people had interactions with the red-headed woodpecker before European settlers arrived in Manitoba and in North America. Woodpeckers were important in many Indigenous cultures as food. They were valued for their plumage as well as medicine. They're often considered lucky birds associated with friendship and happiness, or some groups associate them with hard work and perseverance. And there are many stories and teaching using woodpeckers, such as Nanabush or Nanabuju and the red-headed woodpecker. And one of these stories describes how red-headed woodpeckers, not necessarily the species, but woodpeckers with red heads, how they got those red heads. In terms of the relationship of red-headed woodpeckers and European settlers, the English naturalist Mark Catesby first described and illustrated the red-headed woodpecker in The Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahamas between 1729 and 1732. And the print that went with that book is shown on the side of the screen here. And when we talk later about the habitat, you'll see that the oak tree illustrated here does tie in with the red-headed woodpecker. The red-headed woodpecker was considered an agricultural pest of both orchards and stored nuts and grain. They were also hunted for sport due to its bright colored plumage. And it was a favorite bird, or a noted favorite bird, of several early birders in North America. You may recognize the names of James Audubon, related to the Audubon Society, as well as Alexander Wilson, who has several birds named after him. And on the topic of names, getting to the many names that the red-headed woodpecker has, it's probably not a surprise that such a striking and easily recognizable species has quite a number of common names. So the most widely known would be the red-headed woodpecker. And then the rest of these seem to be largely based off of the plumage as well. In terms of half a shirt bird and shirt-tailed bird, you can certainly see in this picture with the wings spread how you can come to the conclusion that maybe they should tuck in their shirt or tuck in their white feathers, or how it looks like they're wearing half a shirt. I'm not sure where jellycoat came from. I couldn't find a reason behind that naming. But flagbird and patriotic bird actually both come from our neighbors to the south. While the upper part of the red-headed woodpecker's wings and back look black, when the sun hits it, it can have a blue sheen to it. So then you've got a bird that is red, white, and blue, which may remind you of a certain flag of our neighbors down south. For flying checkerbird, I made a pun here without even trying. Flying checkerboard bird, you can also see how they get their name from that black and white coloration. And if I was to go with a secondary common name, I think tricolored woodpecker fits quite well, as all the red, the black, and the white do really stand out. In terms of names from different indigenous groups, we have the general words for woodpecker, bapase, in Anishinaabe, and Chankatoto or Chankatotona in Dakota. The scientific name for the red-headed woodpecker is Melanerpes erythrocephalus, and this is actually a very fitting name as well. When you break down the Greek roots for this name, Melanerpes is combined Greek for black and creeper, as in creeping up a tree. And erythrocephalus combines the words for red and head. So it certainly has black on it, certainly creeps up the tree in the behavior that woodpeckers show. And of course, the red head is quite striking. Of course, we all know that woodpeckers are quite well adapted for the way that they create cavities and look for food, especially in relating to how they work with trees. And a big question is, how do they do all this without getting a headache? The strike of a woodpecker can be up to 1,000 times the force of gravity. Of course, humans cannot withstand anything near that amount. So how do woodpeckers do it? They have a number of different adaptations, a lot of which are in the head area. Of course, as this is where the all-important brain is stored, and you wouldn't want the impact of using your head and your beak to hammer into the wood to damage any of that. So red-headed woodpeckers have a self-sharpening chisel-like beak. And the fact that their beak is shaped the way it is, and the fact that it is as sharp as it is, means the beak moves into the wood instead of stopping abruptly. And this reduces the force that the red-headed woodpecker's head experiences. Additionally, they have reduced space in the cranium, so the brain has less space to bounce around inside the skull. And this helps to reduce the jarring that the impact that the brain would have when they do hammer into the wood. Additionally, the brain is oriented to spread the force out across it rather than concentrate any force that the woodpecker would experience in one area of the brain. Additionally, there are modifications in the bone structure of both the skull and the mandible that allow deformation of the bone, so bending of the bone, and that deflects the energy from the strike away from the cranium. Additionally, they have very strong neck muscles and hyoid muscles, and we'll get into the hyoid in a second, that supports the head. And when these muscles contract, they help hold the skull and spine in place in a similar way to how a seatbelt would hold a person in a seat in an accident. They also have further adaptations for feeding. And these include a long tongue with sticky saliva and hair-like protrusions on it. So different species of red-headed woodpeckers, different species of woodpeckers in general have different lengths of tongue. The red-headed woodpeckers have an intermediate tongue length compared to some other woodpeckers. So pileated woodpeckers, for example, have a shorter tongue relative to their body size, whereas a woodpecker like the northern flicker, which I have a picture of here on the right-hand side of your screen, has a very long tongue for their body size. And the red-headed woodpecker's tongues are extremely important, or I guess woodpecker tongues in general are extremely important to be able to get inside those holes that they are drilling to access the insects that are inside the trees or inside the wood. So the tongue itself needs some kind of support. Otherwise, when it came out of the mouth, it would just flop down. But woodpecker tongues are in fact quite dexterous. So the tongue is supported by a cartilage and Y-shaped structure called the hyoid apparatus. So I had mentioned the hyoid muscles earlier. So there's also the hyoid apparatus. Humans also have a hyoid, but it is quite different. It's located in sort of the upper part of our throat. But for the woodpeckers, the hyoid bone rests inside a sheath that keeps them lubricated and allows them to slide forward as the tongue is extended. The base of the hyoid bone, which would be the bottom branch of a Y, which you can see in this picture of the northern flicker, extends all the way to the tip of the muscular tongue. And then the other two forks of the Y attach in front of the throat. And this is where most of the muscles that control the hyoid attach. And then the two horns of the Y grow backwards from this area towards the base of the skull. And when they're fully grown, the sheath around them fuses with the skull. And there are special muscles that originate on the lower jaw that attach at the fork of the hyoid to control the tongue. The hyoid apparatus can be extremely long, wrapping all the way from behind the eyes to the top of the head, even to the nostril area, which is the case for the northern flicker. I also mentioned that woodpeckers can have hair-like protrusions, so the red on their tongue, and this close-up here of the tongue in the bottom, that's the tip actually of an acorn woodpecker's tongue. I couldn't find one for the red-headed woodpecker, but many woodpeckers have hair-like or barb-like backwards facing protrusions on their tongue. And that helps to aid the woodpecker in pulling the prey back out of the hole they created, in addition to the use of the sticky saliva. So another interesting behavior that red-headed woodpeckers do is called caching, which is in essence storing their food. So red-headed woodpeckers are one of 4 North American woodpecker species to store food, and the only North American woodpecker species to cover their stored food. Red-headed woodpeckers will hide their food in cracks in wood, under bark, in fence posts, under shingles, etc. The red-headed woodpecker is the most omnivorous of all of our woodpeckers in North America. So they eat a wide variety of both animal prey as well as plant-based food. They can eat insects, spiders, earthworms, nuts, seeds, berries, and less often the eggs and young of other birds, as well as lizards and small rodents. And the proportion of their prey between animal and plant varies with the time of year. So in the summer, approximately 44% of the prey is animal and 66% is plant-based. However, in their overwintering range, their percentage of plant food goes up almost to 100%. So it's much higher in the winter, probably related to what is available in the habitat at that time of year. Red-headed woodpeckers are also excellent flycatchers, and they can exhibit flycatcher-like behavior. For example, sitting out on an open branch, seeing an insect fly by, sallying out to grab that insect and to come back. So if you picture what a flycatcher behavior might look like, red-headed woodpeckers will do that as well. Additionally, like northern flickers, if you're familiar with them, red-headed woodpeckers will spend a significant amount of time foraging on the ground. Red-headed woodpeckers, as I mentioned earlier in the identification portion, are also drum. And drumming is sort of a general woodpecker behavior, and it's the act of rapidly pecking on a resonant object to create a pattern of sound. And woodpeckers can drum on both natural or artificial objects. Often a good surface for drumming on will be hollow, as that helps the sound carry. So for example, a hollow tree will carry the sound of the drumming further than a living tree, as a living tree is more dense. And so why drum? This is all related to communication. They can be looking to attract a mate. They can be looking to advertise a territory or communicate something else with other woodpeckers or other species. For habitat, I'm specifically going to be talking about red-headed woodpecker habitat in Manitoba in the breeding grounds here. The habitat in the wintering grounds can look quite different, mainly because they have different vegetation there, different trees, etc. But in Manitoba, we primarily see red-headed woodpecker in areas with aspen, but also sometimes in areas with oak. They look for areas of standing dead trees, also called snags, in areas with little understory vegetation. So you can see the picture I have of red-headed woodpecker habitat below. You can see that there's very little understory here. A bit more in the foreground, you can see standing dead trees. And then you can see some living trees behind. But generally, it's a very sort of sparse looking habitat. I often see red-headed woodpeckers in farmyard woodlots where the understory is mowed, or in cattle pastures where the cattle are grazing the understory right down. But you can find red-headed woodpeckers in a wide variety of habitats that fit the two main categories, little understory vegetation and standing dead trees. So you can see them in all different kinds of deciduous woodlands, both lowland and upland habitats. You can see them in river bottoms, open woods, orchards, parks, golf courses, open agricultural country, scrub-like grasslands with scattered trees, as well as forest edges and roadsides. You can also see red-headed woodpeckers on foraging on telephone poles. I've seen them also sitting up on telephone wires. And as I mentioned, you can sometimes see them sitting out on branches, fly catching, or also see them on the ground. So when you're looking for red-headed woodpeckers, if you see this habitat of little understory vegetation and standing dead trees, it's always worth it to take a look around and see if you see any red-headed woodpeckers. They do stand out quite a bit from their environment, so they are somewhat easy to see in that way. And their calls are quite loud if you do happen upon one calling. For nesting, red-headed woodpeckers are primary cavity nesting birds. So primary cavity nesters are birds that make their own cavities. And they use these snags or dead parts of living trees in order to make their cavity. Snags, or sort of dead standing trees, or the dead parts of living trees, the decaying wood is softer than the living wood, so it's easier for the red-headed woodpeckers to make their cavity. Red-headed woodpeckers do not have the strongest beaks of our different woodpecker species in Manitoba. So they do often look for an existing fissure or crack in the tree to get them started. In Manitoba, they usually nest in aspen trees with a diameter of 30 centimeters at chest height. So if you were to go and hug the tree, if it's got a diameter of 30 centimeters, that could be a good nesting tree for the red-headed woodpecker. They are quite faithful and will return to a past breeding territory. However, they rarely reuse a cavity. I couldn't find a specific reason as to why they will rarely reuse a cavity. However, on my work with trees, swallows, and purple martins, they are both cavity nesters, and the cavity, by the time the young have fledged the nest, is generally quite dirty, and there are parasites that would be living in the cavity at that point. So it may be advantageous when raising next year's young to start fresh with a new cavity. Both the male and female red-headed woodpeckers will work together to make the cavity, although the male will do the majority of the excavation work. And red-headed woodpeckers are quite territorial of their nesting area, both with other red-headed woodpeckers as well as other birds that use similar resources. These other birds can be other woodpeckers like downy woodpeckers, as well as other birds that have a similar foraging style, things like brown creepers and white-breasted nuthatches. Red-headed woodpeckers lay between 4 to 7 eggs. On average, they can lay more or less than that as well. They incubate for 12 to 14 days, and nestlings fledge after a further 27 to 30 days, where they are then dependent on their parents for a further 25 days. An interesting thing about red-headed woodpeckers in incubation, both male and female red-headed woodpeckers develop a brood patch, which is where they lose feathers on their chest, and that skin becomes vascularized, and it helps in transferring heat from the parents to the eggs. And not all bird species have the male and female developing this brood patch. The young red-headed woodpeckers look a little bit different from their parents. I have a picture here on the right-hand side of the screen. You can see quite obviously they're missing the red head. Instead, it's a chestnut brown. However, the overall pattern of the plumage fits in with the adult red-headed woodpeckers. So in areas where the adults are black, the young are that chestnut brown, and in areas where the adults are white, the young are also white. So it is still quite easy to recognize the young red-headed woodpeckers as red-headed woodpeckers. And so this whole process of going from egg to the young being independent from their parents takes about 2 months. So the red-headed woodpecker is a species at risk. They are threatened in Manitoba and endangered federally under the Species at Risk Act. Overall in Canada, they have a decline of approximately 1.88% per year, going from 1970 to 2016, which in that time frame adds up to a total decline of 58% across Canada. And as you can see from this map here, with red being the strongest decline and blue being the strongest population increase, they are declining across a lot of their range in both United States and Canada. Our population in Manitoba is actually not faring as poorly as populations in other parts of their range. Our red-headed woodpeckers in more central and northern Manitoba have a stronger population decline, but our red-headed woodpeckers in southern Manitoba are doing not so bad comparatively. It's estimated there are between 4,000 and 6,000 individuals in Canada. However, red-headed woodpeckers are not well surveyed with the most common repeated bird survey method, which is the breeding bird survey. It can be hard to tell local trends due to the relatively small number of breeding bird survey routes. Historically, there was actually quite a high abundance of red-headed woodpeckers in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially with the arrival of European settlers and when land clearing started. There was an increase in open farmlands, in fence rows, and small woodlots, which provided the species ample habitat in the eastern and central regions of North America. However, forest clearing continued into the 20th century, and especially in the eastern and central United States, there was the disappearance of the extensive mature oak and beech forests that produce large quantities of the beech nuts and acorns that the species depends on for migratory species in their overwintering grounds. But then also, like I mentioned, a large portion of red-headed woodpeckers sort of stay in that general area year-round in the United States. There was a brief rebound of the population from the 1950s to the 1970s, and this corresponded with a pulse of standing deadwood or snags following the demise of many American elms that had succumbed to the fungal Dutch elm disease. However, even as a large portion of these elm trees became standing dead from Dutch elm disease, then a lot of these species became fallen dead. Sorry, a lot of these trees became fallen dead at a similar time. And so this population surge was short-lived. As that habitat declined, so did the abundance of red-headed woodpeckers. So what are some causes for the decline of red-headed woodpeckers? Well, you may have guessed the one being loss of habitat, as I was just talking about it in the last slide here. But the loss of habitat is mainly removal of snags and standing deadwood. This can be for a number of reasons. The first is aesthetic purposes. A lot of people don't find standing deadwood to be a particularly nice thing to look at. Of course, there are sometimes safety issues associated with standing deadwood, as it can fall and perhaps fall on people or property or animals, etc. There's also harvesting activities or converting of sites to agriculture. In this case, this image was previously red-headed woodpecker nesting habitat. But as you can see, it's along a roadside and it's been cleared. My guess is probably for fencing. We also have the suppression of disturbances that can create standing deadwood in the first place. So for example, a fast-moving forest fire may clear out the underbrush and may kill the trees, but leave those trees standing, and now they're standing deadwood. There's also the impact of pesticides on red-headed woodpeckers. I mentioned that red-headed woodpeckers are quite good fly catchers, and additionally, they do hammer into trees and look for insects that way, just as other woodpeckers do. And as we use more pesticides, that obviously decreases the insect population. And especially with these two causes for decline, it actually used to be much more common to see red-headed woodpeckers in city parks and riparian corridors along rivers, but the policies of standing deadwood removal and pesticide use, with these two policies, it's becoming less common to see red-headed woodpeckers in cities and riparian corridors like we have, especially in Winnipeg. And another cause for loss of habitat, even if the standing dead trees do remain, they also need that, low understory vegetation. So if a red-headed woodpecker is nesting in a cattle pasture, for example, and cattle stop grazing and shrubby vegetation starts to grow back up higher, that now makes that habitat not as good for red-headed woodpeckers, even if the snag remains. In terms of a cause of decline on the wintering grounds, fewer beech nuts in the wintering range is an issue, and we'll get into this a little bit with invasive species, but there's also clearing of these forests of beech trees that previously existed in their wintering range. And then combining this with invasive species. So there are a variety of tree diseases that will temporarily increase habitat, but then in the long run, as the standing deadwood becomes fallen deadwood, decreases habitat. So things like chestnut blight for chestnut trees, Dutch elm disease for elm trees, and beech bark disease for beech trees. So, like I said, leads to a short pulse in standing deadwood, but a longer term reduction in habitat. And additionally, for chestnut trees and beech trees, as they die, they also now no longer produce that food source. Additionally, red-headed woodpeckers have an issue with vehicle collisions. Some of their habitat tends to be along roadways, as we tend to mow our ditches. And so if there's standing deadwood, that creates an attractive habitat. Additionally, like I had mentioned earlier, they do forage on the ground. So this puts them at a lower level with cars. So vehicle collisions, while not being a main cause for decline, does contribute to death and injury with red-headed woodpeckers sometimes. The red-headed woodpecker also has quite an important role in the habitat. Like I said, they are a primary cavity nesting species, so they create their own cavities. And because they don't reuse their cavities, these cavities are kind of left over and can be used by other birds, mammals, insects, and amphibians. So there are some birds called secondary cavity nesters that use cavities to nest in for the breeding season, but they cannot create their own cavity. So they're looking for cavities that other species have made, and red-headed woodpeckers provide this. As well, for the mammals, insects, and amphibians, these cavities can be good places to overwinter. Cavities also contribute to the breakdown of standing deadwood to fallen deadwood. As the tree is decaying, having extra holes in it allow the elements to get in, like the rain, and this can speed up these trees decaying. And then, of course, standing deadwood becomes falling deadwood, and as it decays more, nutrients are recycled back into the environment. Red-headed woodpeckers also distribute large numbers of acorns, beech nuts, and other nuts and seeds when it feeds in caches, particularly if those caches are forgotten about. So the role of red-headed woodpeckers and the Manitoba IBA program. Some of you are probably aware about the Important Bird Areas program in general. It is an international initiative started by BirdLife International. And our local important bird areas were nominated and chosen in Manitoba, largely in 1999, although there have been some changes since then. And IBAs are identified in Canada largely under two categories, where they either support large congregations of birds or they are areas of importance to species at risk. So originally we had one IBA that was identified for red-headed woodpeckers, which is circled in red here, and it's called Minnesota-Lafleur IBA. And for an IBA to be identified for red-headed woodpecker, it needs to contain 14 individuals. So not very high, but we also don't have a very large population of red-headed woodpeckers. So our program started holding citizen science blitzes to record red-headed woodpecker numbers in 2017. And we use two methods to do this. Whenever you're doing survey work or scientific work, there's always the conflict between covering a large area and being very thorough. As we have limited time, limited volunteer resources, we want to try to get the most bang for our buck. So we do this through two different monitoring methods. We have IBA-wide blitzes, and where we have citizen scientists assigned to different areas of an important bird area and have them searching for red-headed woodpecker habitat or red-headed woodpeckers themselves. And you can see an example of this in our breakdown of Oak Lake Plum Lake IBA on the right-hand side of your screen. We would have a group searching the roots in white, a group searching the roots in blue, and a group searching the roots in red. So because these areas don't overlap, any red-headed woodpeckers we count on the same day can be added to make a total, and it allows us to survey a big portion of the IBA. In this example, where there are no roots, generally there either are no roads or we don't expect there to be good red-headed woodpecker habitat in the area. So we really will have surveyed most of the area we expect to be good for red-headed woodpeckers. However, we do have red-headed woodpecker specific survey routes, and these are routes established that we can survey the same route year after year following the same method. So we can look to see how red-headed woodpecker numbers are changing between years with everything else holding the same. And red-headed woodpeckers in both cases are generally surveyed by looking for the appropriate habitat. And once that habitat is found, we have volunteers observing, both looking and listening for red-headed woodpeckers. And if red-headed woodpeckers are not observed, we then have a permit to conduct playback for 30 seconds. And this involves playing the quirr or the chirr call. And then after 30 seconds, that is stopped. And then we observe, look and listen for another 2 minutes. We do keep the amount of playback used to a minimum, as it is energetically expensive for the red-headed woodpeckers to come in and respond to that call. So we follow really strict guidelines when using that. So I'm not sure where everybody is from across Manitoba in the webinar here. So I thought I'd go into different IBAs across our province where you might find red-headed woodpeckers, and hopefully give you a couple tips if you want to search for these woodpeckers within the IBAs. So I thought I'd start off with our original IBA for red-headed woodpeckers, Minnesota-Lafleur, and it is just to the east of Riding Mountain National Park. So you can see the IBA outlined in orange here, and some particular hotspots for red-headed woodpecker include the mile roads to the east of where Highway 50 and 250 meet, which you can see circled in the right-hand corner of the image, as well as the little north-south jog and Highway 50 seen circled in the middle, as well as Highway 462 and the associated mile roads to either side, both within the IBA as well as just south of the IBA. And when the program has surveyed here back in 2017 and 2018, we saw between 23 and 29 red-headed woodpeckers. Another good one for red-headed woodpeckers closer to Winnipeg would be Northeast and West Shoal Lakes IBA, not to be confused with the Shoal Lakes in Western Manitoba. You can find red-headed woodpeckers all around this IBA. I've circled the east side in particular as I've had good luck there, but there are red-headed woodpeckers found in the north. You can also find them in the south as well as the west. So really, if you pick a part of the habitat, you're probably going to run into red-headed woodpeckers. We've been surveying here since 2018, and we see anywhere between 13 and 19 individuals doing the surveys here. We've also long suspected that there is a significant concentration of red-headed woodpeckers just to the northeast of the Shoal Lakes IBA, including the area around Narcisse, Inwood, Comarno, and more. Up into the sort of northern interlake, but in the interior. And so we have somewhat surveyed in the past, getting between 7 to 11 individuals. In 2021, we did a much more thorough survey and 70 individuals were seen outside the IBA. There is a lot of cattle farming in this area, so a lot of really grazed understory vegetation, and then those standing deadwood, that standing deadwood, which is great red-headed woodpecker habitat. For those of you who are more in eastern Manitoba, we have the Netley-Bow Marsh. 2021 was the first time we specifically surveyed for red-headed woodpeckers here. And the two concentrations we found is one on the east side of the IBA, in and along the mile roads there, as well as up near the Chalet Beach Matlock area also has red-headed woodpeckers. And then going to southwestern Manitoba, just a little bit west of Brandon, we have the Oak Lake Plum Lakes IBA. And this has several different hotspot areas for red-headed woodpeckers. The topmost circle there indicates the mile roads between Highway 254 and the IBA boundary, just northeast of Oak Lake Beach, as well as when Highway 254 runs east-west along there. There's areas of good red-headed woodpecker habitat, both within the IBA as well as outside the IBA. And there are also areas in the two most southern circles around Delow and Pipestone that also have red-headed woodpeckers. So 2019, we counted 10 individuals in the IBA, 2020, similar 11 individuals. 2021, like I mentioned, we were really stepping up our red-headed woodpecker monitoring, and we found 27 individuals in the IBA. A lot of this was with the help of a lot of dedicated volunteers who really combed the IBA quite closely. And this is the first time where we've reached that, or I guess surpassed that threshold of 14 red-headed woodpeckers needed to have a red-headed woodpecker trigger for this IBA. So you may have noticed in 2021, I talked a couple times about us sort of ramping up our search for the red-headed woodpeckers. So the red-headed woodpecker is a spotlight species in our Conservation Champions program that we are continuing this year. And we have a three-part approach. We're doing outreach with community groups, classrooms, and landowners, a lot like this presentation. We're also monitoring for these spotlight species with citizen scientists, as well as looking to work with landowners to implement voluntary protection for these species habitat on private land, where we would partner with landowners for a non-binding 5-year agreement to protect the land in exchange for a gate sign and an optional bird survey if they want to be recognized for the work that they're doing for these species. So what can you do to help? Well, if you have land with standing dead trees, leaving these standing dead trees is an excellent option. When safe, or if safe, particularly if you have a piece of land where there is a little understory vegetation, such as if you mow a treed area, or if you do own area with cattle grazing. If we don't have private land where we can implement these management options, we can also advocate for leaving standing dead trees in public areas when safe. So even though they might not look the nicest, if it's a situation where it's still safe to have them standing, they can be used not only by red-headed woodpeckers, but a large variety of species. We can also advocate for less pesticide use in public spaces. Like I mentioned, if you have land with red-headed woodpeckers, you're welcome to send me an email to look into becoming a conservation champion. And of course, you're welcome to join us for red-headed woodpecker survey routes or bird blitzes. We're also holding them in 2022, and they are suitable for all skill levels. And like you saw in when I described the different IBAs and habitat, we move throughout the province. So we probably have one near you. And if you're interested in learning more about any of this, you can email me at iba@naturemanitoba.ca, which is the same email where you would have signed up for the webinar today. And with that, that's the end of the presentation. And thank you very much for joining us today. And I really hope you learned something interesting about red-headed woodpeckers. And if anybody has any questions, you're welcome to type them in the chat. Or you're also welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question as well.
Hi, man. It's Paul Gosen here.
Hello, Paul.
I understand that Ken DeSmit, who is a previous species at risk biologist for Manitoba, about a year or two, did a significant survey in a good portion of Manitoba and found what he thought was a substantial number of red-headed woodpeckers, which sort of, if I might say, blew the numbers out of the park for red-headed woodpeckers here in Canada. Can you comment on that as to whether that has been looked at more closely or written up, or just comment on that?
Right. Yeah. So the 4,000 to, I think I said 6,000 individuals. So that was based on the breeding bird survey, which, like you said, once Ken did his surveys in Manitoba, we've seen that it's not necessarily the best indicator of the number of red-headed woodpeckers. And that work is sort of where we based some of our surveying on when we decided to survey northeast of the Shoal Lakes. Some of that decision was based on Ken's data, as well as additional surveys that Tim Poole, who's a species at risk biologist for Manitoba, has done since taking over Ken's positions once he retired. So with that information from Ken, as well as the information we've collected and Tim has collected in 2021, we are proposing several new IBAs for red-headed woodpeckers in those areas of hotspots, or some of the areas of hotspots that Ken had discovered. So particularly in areas of the interlake interior, going from the southern interlake almost up to the northern interlake, as well as areas in southeastern Manitoba. As far as I know, that hasn't been written up anywhere, but I could be mistaken. That data is with the Conservation Data Center, which is how we accessed it. So it is available for people doing research and such things, to my knowledge.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for bringing that up. I'm just scrolling up here on the chat. John says, are you able to talk a little bit more about what self-sharpening beak means? I don't know too much what goes into the process, other than the fact that the beak itself doesn't get dull. And if the beak was dull, that would mean when the woodpecker would strike the surface, all that energy that it's striking the surface with also comes back into the red-headed woodpecker just through the physics of it all. So the fact that the beak stays sharp allows it to slide through the wood and reduces the impact that the red-headed woodpecker would face whenever it hammers into the wood. So David had asked, are IBA blitzes for red-headed woodpeckers done prior to fledging? We do our surveys both before and after fledging. Generally, woodpeckers are more responsive to playback, and they're just sort of more active and territorial in general earlier in the breeding season. So that is when we like to try to get our blitzes done, as it is easier to see the red-headed woodpeckers because they're out and around more often and they're responding to playback. However, they do stick around and they are quite territorial even later in the breeding season. So depending on the timing of what we're able to get done, red-headed woodpeckers can also be surveyed later in the season. And like I said, you can't tell the male and females apart, but we do note when and if we see young red-headed woodpeckers as well, as they'll often be out and about later in the season once they're out of the nest, even if they are still dependent on their parents. Ken asks, when and how are the surveys done? So the actual surveys for the red-headed woodpeckers, the ones that we try to follow the same routes and repeat every year, those will be done within the breeding bird season, so earlier in the season, sort of June to mid-July. And those surveys are done by driving along a set route, and the route sort of length and direction varies depending on the IBA. And these routes were set according to previous records we have of red-headed woodpeckers and their habitat. And so a group drives along in their car, and once they hit good red-headed woodpecker habitat, they stop and they do that 2-minute observation period, followed by 30 seconds of playback if nothing's heard, and then 2 minutes of observation again. And then they record whether they see red-headed woodpeckers or not, how many red-headed woodpeckers, adults, young, that kind of thing. And then they continue on. The next survey spot will either be in the next area of appropriate red-headed woodpecker habitat, or if the red-headed woodpecker habitat is continuous, it'll be 300 meters from the first stop. And this is to avoid double counting individuals. So it's assumed after 300 meters, you are now in a new territory for red-headed woodpeckers if there are red-headed woodpeckers there. Lewis asks about fledging mortality since 4 to 7 eggs are quite a few young. In terms of hatching young, I believe the red-headed woodpeckers, I guess hatching and getting them out of the nest, red-headed woodpeckers have quite a good track record for that, especially compared to some other species. I know Lewis is involved in chimney swift stuff with us, and chimney swifts don't necessarily have a great track record for getting young out of the nest. I'm not sure about the mortality in terms of, say, going from a young of the year through migration and coming back to the breeding grounds. That could be another story. However, mortality tends to be higher for long distance migrants. So the fact that red-headed woodpeckers don't necessarily travel all that far may be helpful to them in that case as well. We had also had a question here, are there woodpeckers found along the Seine River? I don't actually live in that area of Winnipeg, so I can't tell you 100%. A great place to check for that is actually the website ebird.org, I believe, where you can, they'll have an explore, I think it's explore species section of the website where you can click into there and you can scroll around in North America and also zoom in on specific areas and see where people have reported red-headed woodpeckers. So that can be a great spot. I'm assuming there's probably standing dead there. I just don't know what the understory vegetation is like. But certainly the areas along riparian areas historically have been a spot where red-headed woodpeckers are seen. So far it looks like we have finished the questions in the chat. I'll be sticking around a little bit longer, so feel free if you're still thinking on your question to type that in. I did also just want to let people know that our fourth webinar is on birding in the dark, nocturnal and crepuscular birds of Manitoba. And that will be taking place not next Wednesday, but the Wednesday after, so May 4th. So if you'd like to join us, we do still have space available. It would be at 7 p.m., just like tonight. So if you haven't signed up for that, you're welcome to do so by emailing me. But otherwise, it looks like we will wrap up here. So thank you very much for joining me tonight. And I've hoped you've learned a little bit and also enjoyed yourself. And for all of you joining us at the next webinar, we'll see you in a couple of weeks.